You are now watching Believe. Do you believe?
Josh Kendall joins me now, the beat reporter for The Athletic covering the Atlanta Falcons, and somebody who I really love to talk kind of roster management, construction, all of those good things with. Josh, how are you doing?
Doing good, Will. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so obviously you and I have talked once or twice about the 53-man roster, kind of what we expected they could do, certain position strengths, weaknesses, numbers they could keep here and there. I think that this year was pretty difficult, all things considered. It was one of the more difficult kind of cut downs to predict because there were a lot of spots where there seemed like pretty consistent competition. But I think that we did have a decent pulse, and, I use we as in the media, those who are kind of paying attention on what the decisions, maybe not what they resulted in, but what they probably were. That being said, was there anything that really stood out to you on first glance looking over the 53-man roster?
We mentioned it just shortly before we started recording here, but probably, Parker Hesse and not Anthony Firkser. I mean, Firkser's a guy who comes from Tennessee, has got experience in the NFL, has got time with Arthur Smith, just felt like a guy who, when they signed him as a free agent, you plug and play. Hesse's a guy who's a converted defensive end from Iowa who showed some flashes in the practice squad. I thought looked good in training camp, but felt more like a guy that Atlanta could stash on the practice squad and let develop a little more. Excuse me.
Yeah, it's really because Firkser to me kind of fit the mold of, like a Luke Stalker, maybe more than a Hayden Hurst. I don't know where his upside is there, but definitely one of these guys that Arthur Smith has liked to have, which is your second tight end, who's not necessarily your premier tight end, although I would say that Kyle Pitts is far and away the maybe most talented kind of tight end that he has had to work with. Usually they're a little bit closer in skill set, but there is a more defined one, and then a number two who's capable of getting it done in a couple of different ways. To me, that was clearly Firkser on this offense. So I agree. I think that him not making this 53, and we'll get into, maybe the reasons for that here in a little bit, but that definitely jumped out to me. I thought some of the defensive linemen, them choosing to go with Timmy Horn over a guy like Abdullah Anderson or Derek Tangelo, that was a little bit shocking. And then another one that we'll get into a little bit further on down the line is Jared Bernhardt making the roster. And I know that was one that everybody was excited to see. Still, I think a little bit of a surprise, not maybe now where we are, but certainly if you had said at the beginning of camp, he would be on the 53. That would have come as a surprise to a lot of people. So you and I spoke midway through camp about the defensive line and whether or not specifically there would be 5 or 6 guys when all is said and done. And I told you that I thought it would come down to kind of how they felt about the linebackers and which one they wanted to see more of. As the preseason progressed, I actually thought that the defensive line competition became much more interesting than the linebacker competition. That being said, they chose to go with 5 guys at each linebacker spot. Do you have a sense for why that is?
Not other than Nate Landman is just a better football player than I realized. I mean, they kept two more linebackers than I thought they would. Landman on the inside and Quentin Bell on the outside. Quentin Bell I knew was going to be close because of his special teams experience. He's a guy coming in to the process that I thought was going to make the roster, and I kind of talked myself out of it, chiefly because the defensive line depth looked not great, but better, I think, than all of us anticipated it to be 5 weeks ago. I mean, I thought Anderson, was a real sort of mid-camp addition steal. Tangelo's a big guy. Looks like he could be a player down the road. They didn't keep either of those guys. They keep Horn and the 2 linebackers. So, I'm sure special teams is a factor there. Though Bell and Landman both can be very valuable on special teams, more than a defensive lineman. But, and I know you run a 3-man front as your base, but keeping 5, I had them keeping 6 defensive linemen. Keeping 5 feels thin to me. We'll see what they do with the practice squad.
Yeah, 5 especially when one of your 5 is Marlon Davidson, who has not been the most reliable, to say the least, on the injury front. So that's definitely going to be something to monitor, to keep an eye on. I agree. I thought Tangelo he's who I had both D'Angelo and Anderson making this roster, honestly. And I had Horn as my practice squad guy. So it's kind of funny that they ended up flipping that a little bit there. Of course, I think Anderson and Tangelo would make a lot of sense if they decide to bring them back, whether that is on the 53-man roster as part of, maybe a move, or to the practice squad if they clear waivers. I'm certain that would be something they would be probably interested in. So,
I mean, Davidson might go on the IR tomorrow, and one of those guys comes back immediately. We don't know what the severity of his knee injury is really. So you mentioned that, but because of the way the rules work, if they put guys on the IR in training camp, they're done for the year. If they put them on the 53, then put them on the IR, they can come back in 4 weeks. So, Arthur Smith said 1,000 times, the initial 53 is just initial. It's going to change. It's going to change. It's going to change. That could be a change we see quickly.
Another change that we could see quickly is something that you mentioned in your final prediction for the 53-man roster, and that would be John Fitzpatrick, potentially also going on that short-term IR to start the season after kind of missing the last little bit of practice there, the final preseason game. Never really got a good sense for why, but you posited that if Fitzpatrick went on IR, that would open up a spot for Parker Hesse in your prediction notes because you had Anthony Ferkser making this team. Now that we know Hesse's on it and Ferkser is not, do you think that you had the right idea, but maybe just the wrong players there?
Maybe. Fitzpatrick is a real question mark to me. I mean, this is a guy who played 4 snaps in the first preseason game of the year, which to me didn't set off alarm bells, but made me wonder kind of what's going on there. You would think they would throw him in there and let him get a taste of it more than that right away. Didn't play in the last preseason game. I don't know. When they cut when Atlanta cut Justin Schaefer, the other late round draft pick out of Georgia, news that we found out sort of earlier in the day, it made me wonder, might they get rid of Fitzpatrick too? At the end of the day, just being big, being able to play that third tackle, clearly that has some value for Arthur Smith. I mean, he needs a Lee Smith, big bully tight end. I guess they think Fitzpatrick can be that, but you're right. Fitz could go on IR tomorrow, then we're right back to replacing him with a guy who's like with Ferkser, if you do that, who's not that type of player.
Yeah, they would definitely be much more of a receiving tight end group, with Parker Hesse maybe being your best blocker of the bunch. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how that would all shake out. It would be who?
I said Parker's kind of a middle ground between a pass catcher and a blocking guy. I mean, I think probably Ferkser is a clear catch first guy. Fitzpatrick is a clear block first guy. Maybe Parker Hesse fits in there because they like him. He fills some middle ground.
Yeah, and then the other wrinkle here with tight end, and I'm curious your thoughts on this because it stood out to me looking over everything, is that they have Felipe Franks fully listed as a tight end. Are we buying that? I mean, clearly he would be able to serve as a quarterback in a pinch, but it's interesting that they didn't go 3 quarterbacks, 3 tight ends and have it officially listed as 2 quarterbacks, 4 tight ends. Would you be able to hazard a guess as to why that is?
No idea, but I don't think it matters much. I had him making this team as a quarterback, but thinking he was going to play a lot more tight end. I mean, does Anthony Ferkser become less valuable because they think Felipe Franks is that good? I mean, I think Felipe Franks was impressive considering he was a quarterback last year, but I thought he was sort of your depth emergency tight end. That's how I had him in my mind. Do they think he's a step above that? Do they think he's potentially a second or third guy or however it shakes out? Maybe so.
That would be really interesting because, for as much fun as he was in training camp, he's the perfect training camp story. And that's different than necessarily being a real valuable option when the games matter in the fall. Like, yeah, he made some splash plays, but I don't know if I'm still there yet with him being your true prove it number 2 out there kind of, half the snaps on offense, a quarter of the snaps on offense. He's more of your gadgety guy still in my book, but hey, you're right. Maybe the team does feel differently, or at least they want to expand his role and feel he's ready for that, or this could all be nonsense and Ferkser's back on the team in 48 hours and
Right.
this is all good to go. So like you said, it is definitely fluid. And I think that is the key point here to note. But Jared Bernhardt, I want to circle back to him. He is the story, I think, out of camp. I've said it a million times. If it was Hard Knocks and they were in Atlanta, he would be absolutely the star of that show. And he's on the roster. But like I just said, there's a big difference in preseason and the regular season. What kind of role do you anticipate Jared Bernhardt actually having with this team? And do you expect it to be anything beyond kind of special teams?
No, not initially. I mean, he's a guy that I've gone through several phases with, from thinking he was a neat story who was going to potentially end up on the practice squad, to thinking he's going to make this team, to thinking, no, I'm just talking myself into that because he's such a great story, to thinking, no, really, he may make this team. And he was in my final 53-man roster. He's really intriguing to me. He's very athletic. He looks the part on the practice field. He's got sure hands. He's very valuable on special teams. I would think, as a coaching staff, the two hardest things to do, the two hardest ends of the spectrum would be to fairly evaluate like unknown guys versus name guys. When it really comes down to it, if you're making those cuts, I'm looking at a guy who was drafted in the second round 2 years ago versus a guy who's off the street. Can I really be, completely blank and look at them as completely equals when I'm making my evaluation? So I think there's a danger always that you've got to fight, because everybody says everybody's the same once they get in the building. So I think you probably have to really fight yourself for that. I also think at the other end of the spectrum, there's a danger of falling in love with how smart you are with, look at this guy that we found. Look how neat he is. We're geniuses. Look what we've done. I'm not saying Jared Bernhardt is that guy, because he's clearly, this is an athletic dude. This is a guy who I think has potential. But, like you say, we've seen a ton of guys look great in the preseason and never heard from him again in the regular season. I think Jared Bernhardt starts as a special teams guy who, when they need a sixth receiver, when they need some depth, he comes in. If he keeps making those plays, then he gets more time.
I think it is very clear, how much that the coaching staff does really like Jared Bernhardt. And I really think that the second preseason game, when he was in there and, mostly working with Desmond Ridder, but in particular, he ran a couple of those corner routes. And it was right in the middle of Arthur Smith kind of being in the zone against that kind of cover 3 look. They were talking a lot about it on television, but Jared Bernhardt was the recipient of some of the best plays during some of these drives that Desmond Ridder was in there. And I just kept thinking to myself how uncommonly proficient and professional it looked. Even in the preseason, when things go well, they don't go as well as they would be if starters were executing a certain play or whatever. There's usually still some hiccup or one other note to make about how it could have gone better. But every time he ran that route, it's like he was where he was supposed to be. The ball was delivered on time. He caught it well, and then he made a move afterwards. And it was like, you can see how there's progress to be made. And this ball of clay is certainly one worth working with. And I really do think that it sends a good message to the locker room if you are a coaching staff that does preach a culture of competition, but also accountability, that having guys like Jared Bernhardt, Timmy Horn, D. Alford, from the CFL, having them make the roster does kind of back up that message a little bit, where it's not just lip service to the media. It is, hey, we're going to reward you. It doesn't necessarily matter if you're an undrafted free agent or a CFL player or a second round draft pick. So
I agree.
I think that
they talk a lot about that. So you have to, if you're going to talk that much about it, you've got to put it into action, or at some point people are going to figure it out.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't be phony with that, and because they will figure it out quickest inside of the building. I mean, nowhere else will they know whether or not you're gonna walk the walk than inside of that locker room. So, how much I know that we touched on this a little bit, and really, I mean, this is an answer that's probably hard to actually define, but just how much do we anticipate the roster changing in the next 48 hours? There are a couple guys that we have talked about that you could see them going on IR, at least for a short-term stay. But then this has been a roster that we have talked about openly, throughout the course of training camp and the preseason, saying they're going to be looking at all of the teams and all of the cuts around the league. They have the 8th spot on the waiver wire. They could really choose to take some of these players and add them directly to their 53-man roster. Certainly to the practice squad is an option, but for the 53-man roster specifically, how much turnover do you anticipate in the next couple of days?
Well, I'll give my guy Jeff Schultz a shout out here. A couple of days ago we were trading texts, and he set the over/under at 4.5 for
Nice.
roster moves post the initial 53, and I think that sounds about right to me. That's a lot, but this is kind of how it works. Because we mentioned a couple of guys who might go on IR, because that the Falcons are looking for defensive tackles. I'm happy for Timmy Horn that he made this initial 53, but I don't think he should be very comfortable with that.
Right.
A lot of veteran defensive linemen got cut today. You could see them as early as tomorrow. They're a Falcon, and Timmy Horn goes to the practice squad. So I'll be surprised. I'll be real surprised if it's fewer than 3. I mean, I don't think we're getting to 10, but I think you land 3 and 5, 3 and 6.
Yeah, even 6 would feel like a lot.
Yeah.
But again, like, for as much as I opened up the show saying, yeah, it was a competitive training camp, it was a more difficult kind of roster cut down experiment than usual. It was really just kind of self-contained within the Falcons. And yes, they had a couple joint practices, but it was against the Jets and the Jags. It's not like they're playing the Rams and the Chiefs out here. And there's still a lot of good players around this league. You look at the Jets, that they had to cut and release Bradley Anae, who made a fumble recovery for a touchdown against the Falcons and is considered, I think, a good young player. That's just how deep the Jets are at the defensive line spot. And the Falcons could certainly be a team that says, hey, we're not that deep. We had a competition between 4 guys who, we liked in camp, but we think that your guy is better than all 4 of them, and we're going to just take him. Thank you very much. And I think that there's a real possibility where, again, 6 is high, but certainly maybe 4 opportunities like that present themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be surprised. From the minute Eddie Goldman retired, I think we all, I did, and I think everybody else expected them to add a veteran defensive lineman. They're still, as much as I think we both liked Anderson and Tangelo, and clearly the Falcons liked Horn more. These are still young players. That scares you on the defensive line, I would think. So I think defensive line is the most likely.
Yes, and that's exactly kind of what I wanted to ask you next was, if they were going to make some moves, what spots would they target most heavily? I think defensive line is a no-brainer. You could make the case, because if we are certainly working backwards and saying, all right, last on, first off, and some of these spots where we were saying, okay, Nathan Landman, great addition there, but he was probably on the bubble. Quentin Bell, same thing. However, I don't look at linebacker because of the makeup of the other 8 guys outside of Landman and Bell. I kind of want to see a lot of those guys play this season, and I want to see them get reps. So that doesn't feel like necessarily the best spot to then add another guy to the mix, because you already got 8 guys that you want to see, a lot of this season. Are there any other spots besides defensive line that you think are clear, obvious places where the Falcons might want to add some outside help, given the roster cuts that have happened today?
I don't think so. I mean, let's start at the back and go forward. Safety, they obviously like Richie and Jalen as your starters. Eric Harris is a guy that they're comfortable with. Dean Marlowe looked good in camp. They played him a lot. Cornerback, those 6 guys. D. Alford is a player. D. Alford is not just a feel-good story, although he is that. He's a player. I don't think any of those 6 guys you're looking at moving on. You mentioned the top 4 inside linebacker and the top 4 outside linebacker feel very cut and dried. So we're back to the defensive line, and maybe it's not Timmy Horn if they sign another defensive lineman. Maybe it's not Timmy Horn that they move away from. Maybe it is a Nate Landman. Probably not Quentin Bell. Landman's probably the first, target there if you go outside of the defensive line to cut, because you do have a lot of guys that you want to see play at inside linebacker, and a lot of those guys who can also play special teams. So I don't think so. I mean, I think you're really circling defensive line. Offensive line, obviously, I guess something crazy could happen.
I think that's a spot where they're like, I think every team in the NFL is constantly looking to upgrade their offensive line, like at all times. That's right. A spot where a team makes a move in week 6, and I'm like, yeah, it's an offensive lineman. I get it. So they're like, any option is always on the table for me when it comes to the offensive line.
I thought Afidi was a guy who had a chance to start. Caleb McGarry has played really well and kind of taken that option off the table. But I haven't seen, and Lord knows I am not a football talent scout, especially on the offensive line. So Jermaine Afidi may be great. But I can promise you this, somebody's going to kick the tires on Alex Leatherwood, who the Raiders just up and cut, So, they've already cut Justin Schaefer. You're probably okay. Is Jalen Mayfield safe? I guess. But again, we just saw the Raiders cut Alex Leatherwood. Would it be shocking if the Falcons moved on from Jalen Mayfield? I don't know the severity of his back injury. I don't know what his sickness is. I don't know any of that. There's a ton of information we don't have. But if there's a guard that pops up, I mean, Josh Andrews, who was just about to start for this team last year, is available as of now, or, as of 2 or 3 hours ago. Again, I think you're right. Along the line of scrimmage, it's hard to know how they really feel about any of these guys, and it's never terribly surprising to see them juggle.
Yeah, and because you're either set along the offensive line, and honestly, even the best offensive lines, there's usually one weak link. It's very rare that you feel like, Dallas in the early part of this last decade, where it's like all 5 spots just have Pro Bowlers on them. Right. And GMs usually like to mess around with the offensive line, but yeah, it would. I know I saw Tori McElhaney posited on her kind of like 5 moves piece afterwards. Could Jalen Mayfield, with his lower back injury, be another candidate for an early IR spot? That would potentially open up a run for somebody like Josh Andrews, or, an Alex Leatherwood type, or somebody to come in maybe on a little bit of a trial run, and then you figure things out from there. I think all of this is in play. Wide receiver, and this can be one of our final things. KhaDarel Hodge and Damiere Byrd, I think, were absolutely the right choices. We are seeing, reports that the Falcons were potentially in talks with Laviska Shenault, or with the Jags for Laviska Shenault and a trade there. Preston Williams released by the Dolphins. Apparently there were talks about teams inquiring about him. Do we think that there's another move to be made here at wide receiver, or do you feel like it's pretty set with Hodge, Byrd, and Bernhardt as the final 3? I think Bernhardt would probably be the first out among those 3, but any chance at a wide receiver addition?
I think so. I mean, we talked all offseason about how all of the Falcons wide receivers are going to be 6'10" or taller. Look at all of the Giants. And, they cut Geronimo Allison. They cut Auden Tate. They're still plenty big there. They're still bigger than they were. And I think in their heart of hearts, they liked KhaDarel Hodge more than they thought they might when they brought him in. I mean, I think that this is a guy who looks like a starter. So, but you've still got OZ, who is going to stick with this team. Everybody loves OZ. Damiere, Bernhardt. These are not the big guys that you heard us all talking about. Me, number one, transformed this wide receiver room into a bunch of giants. The final product is not that, but it looks big enough. If they went with these 6 guys, you'd feel like they were better off than they were last year. But you're right. I mean, Arthur Smith still loves big guys, and there's some big guys out there who are intriguing.
Yeah, but I think that the right call was made when it comes to the wide receiver position. I do think that Hodge and Byrd were the 2 best receivers outside of the guys, Bryan Edwards, Olamide Zaccheaus, Drake London, we knew were on the roster. Those 2 were the best outside of Jared Bernhardt among all the receivers. And so I'm pleased that they made it. Like they kind of earned that spot. And so I'm never going to be upset if a player who earned a spot makes the roster. It's as simple as that.
Josh, they didn't force the whole big wide receiver thing.
No, yeah, and that's, I mean, on the one hand, No, I don't think that they're making roster moves just to kind of say like, hey, what narrative, like they're not going to do that because there's much more at stake. That being said, it is funny that it kind of worked out like that. And I'm sure that they're a little pleased that it did. But yeah, I think the best players at that spot, at least through camp, got the roster. So Josh, any other parts of the 53-man roster that we should touch on before we get out of here?
There's nothing else. I think we covered it pretty well. There was no drama in the special teams. Liam McCullough, who's a guy who's got to prove himself in Atlanta. Just got so used to Josh Harris as a plug and play long snapper forever. I think some Falcons fans, whether they realize it or not, are going to look down and see a different number at that position and kind of wonder what's going on. It's a vital position, but clearly McCullough has done, everything they've asked him to do in camp. We touched on every other position. This is, Mariota and Ritter. Those are no-brainers. Franks is your emergency guy. I don't see any big movement there. So, I think we've touched on all of the hot spots.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's notable that quarterback, like we've talked about quarterback all preseason, all training camp long, fortunately doesn't need to be brought up here. There was a camp battle, but turned out not to be much of one. And I think the Falcons are actually pretty pleased with how everything turned out quarterback-wise. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah. I think considering the situation they got themselves in from going after Watson, sort of having to trade Matt Ryan, they couldn't have landed in a better spot. I think both of the quarterbacks looked pretty good in the preseason, which is what you would hope for. I think that they've got an ideal situation in terms of, not that this is how it's going to work out, but you look at it and you think, okay, Marcus Mariota in the ideal world for Atlanta is a bridge quarterback to Desmond Ritter, who's better than the number 74 pick and is the quarterback of the future in Atlanta. You couldn't ask for a better bridge guy than Marcus Mariota. He's a good, solid starter. He's a guy who's going to do everything he can to help Desmond Ritter play well. He's going to be great in the locker room no matter what you end up doing with that position. So I think Atlanta, after everything, ended up looking pretty good at quarterback, all things considered.
Yep, I completely agree. Josh Kendall, thank you so much for joining me. Everybody, please go follow him at Josh the Athletic on Twitter, and you can go read all of his amazing work at The Athletic. Anything else you want to say before I let you go, Josh?
Just forgive all the coughing.
Nah, man, you are a champion throughout training camp and the preseason, and now your reward is here. 4 more months of football. So this is when it all truly begins, my friend. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me.